let's talk serious comic book stuff. Okay, here's a rare hour. Forget the recent Hollywood million zillion dollar stuff. Let's go back and talk about all the work you did, the great work you did at Marvel. At what point, first of all, what do you feel separates Marvel? And I'm entertainment aside, I'm being real, artist to artist. What separates Marvel creatively from all the other times?
Well, I think the difference was Marvel was a little bit more a cult of personality. I tried to give Marvel a personality. I tried to make the readers feel that they knew us, they knew me, they knew the pencilers, they knew the inkers, the letterers, the colorers. And I tried to make it feel like the people who were reading Marvel were part of sort of an inner circle of insiders, and the outside world didn't even know what was going on. Whereas with DC, to me, they were just stories that a magazine company was publishing. You read them, enjoyed them, didn't enjoy them, didn't matter. But with us, I tried to make it like a club, like something that was very intimate and very personal, and we were all on the same wavelength, enjoying the same thing together.
In the 50s, Marvel was known as Atlas and a couple other short-lived titles. Timely in the 40s. It was your idea to change the name to Marvel.
Oh yeah, right.
And that was based on the most popular title from the Golden Age that Timely published, Marvel Comics. You were changing comics in the 60s. The culture of the entire world was changing in the 60s. Did you feel like there was any connection between the other changes of culture with what you were doing creatively at Marvel?
No, not really. It's interesting because so many people read things into things. Actually, the only reason I changed the name of the company, we were called Atlas. When I did the Fantastic Four, the book sold so well. Until the Fantastic Four, we were just another company publishing comics like all the others. The Fantastic Four was a whole new thing in comics, and it was a big success. Then we did the Hulk. Then we did Spider-Man, the X-Men. And I said, boy, we are on to something, because we started getting these great fans, and a lot of excitement was building. And I said, we've got to change the name of the company, because we're not the same company we were when we were Atlas Comics. We're now different, and I wanted to get a great name. I've always loved advertising, and I felt a name like Marvel, and I took that, as you say, from the name of the first magazine we had ever published, even before I came to work there. It was called Marvel Mystery Comics, I think. I said, we'll call it Marvel, because the reason I say I loved advertising, I could get slogans for it. I could have things like, make mine Marvel. Marvel marches on. Welcome to the marvelous world of whatever the hell it was. And we changed our name to Marvel. Now, our competitor was National Comics at that time, which published Superman and Batman. And they thought to themselves, if Atlas is changing its name to Marvel, maybe we'll change our name, we'll show them. So they spent a lot of money and they hired some experts. I don't know where you can find name change experts, but they found one, paid a lot of money, and came up with, instead of National Comics, we'll call ourselves DC. We were Marvel, and they were DC? I mean, what can you do with DC? So that's just an example of good luck for us, I think, that they made a lot of bad decisions. That was like their worst one. DC. And there you go.
Stan wrote, had a different technique where he allowed the artist a little more freedom, and it gave them an opportunity to do more inspired work. Would you elaborate on the remarkable method of writing?
At the time the Fantastic Four came along, I wrote those stories. Then I wrote the X-Men, and then I wrote whatever else came after that. And I had so much writing to do, I didn't have a spare minute. Well, that was okay. I was able to keep up with it, but all of our artists were freelancers, which meant they weren't on salary. So if they weren't drawing anything, they weren't getting paid. So let's say I was writing a Fantastic Four story with Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko was waiting for a Spider-Man script from me. But I didn't have time to write it because I hadn't finished Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four. But I couldn't leave Steve Ditko with nothing to do because he wouldn't get paid. So I came up with the idea. I said, look, Steve, I'll just tell you what the story is. I don't have time to write a script. And I just gave him a brief outline of who the villain would be, what would happen, and how it would end. And I said, now you go ahead and draw it any way you want. You tell the story yourself, as long as you keep within the parameters of what I've told you. Luckily, our artists were all of them. Kirby, Ditko, Romita, Gil Kane, John Buscema, all of them. They were great at story themselves. They knew how to do a story in pictures beautifully. So I could just give any one of them the idea for the story. They would draw it while I was finishing another script. Then they would bring me the artwork, and it was all drawn in pencil. And all I had to do was put in all the dialogue and the captions. Well, I'm pretty fast at that. It didn't take me more than a couple hours to do that. So in that way, we were able to turn out a lot of books in a short period of time. And I got the best thinking of the artist story-wise, and none of the artists were sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They were all working, and that became known as the Marvel Method. It allowed us to work much faster, and I think it gave us better stories, because instead of me writing panel 1, page 6, make this a close-up, panel 2, make it a long shot, I left that to the artists. And the artists were good at that, probably better at that than I was. So we actually, I think, got better stories than we would have had if I wrote a complete script. And that is how it happened.
I'd like to mention, in addition to, you named Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, John Buscema, John Romita, a couple other, those artists would have been Gene Colan, Jim Steranko, or Wally Wood.
Right.
In your autobiography, and elsewhere in various interviews, people have asked you how you got into the business, and I'm not asking you that, but your answer frequently is that you answered an ad, and you were surprised that it turned out to be Martin Goodman's publishing company. Oh, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Kind of thing. But you also commented, you thought, well, I want to be a writer. I want to be the great American novelist, and maybe I'll just warm up here with comics for a couple of years. But you have to realize, at what point did you realize, and how do you feel that now you're much more famous? There's very few novelists, great American novelists, that can compete with what you've accomplished through your work in Marvel Comics. Is there any point that you started thinking, I think I'll stay here, this is working at
I stayed there because I began to find the work interesting. It is really, when I started in comics, nobody had any respect for comic books. They were considered junk. And most people thought they're just read by little kids or dumb adults, and they had no quality as far as the public was concerned. Frankly, I almost felt that way myself. But the more I got into it, and the more I realized how talented the artists were, and the more I realized what fun it was to write these stories and keep them going and see where the characters would grow and evolve, I began to enjoy it. I don't know at what point it was, but somewhere along the way, I figured, that's it, I'm in the comic book business, and I like it. And I've liked it ever since. But I've always felt I'd like to do other things also. So I'm kind of lucky because now I'm involved with movies and television and DVDs and stuff on the internet. So I'm having a lot of fun. And but comics still, they're like the breeding ground for so many other things. And out in Hollywood, they're so important because all of the producers and the TV networks, they study these comic books looking for the next big thing. And Marvel, and I must say DC started that because of the success of Superman and Batman and the X-Men and even Blade, the Vampire Hunter, the first one, which was a bigger hit than anybody thought. That was Marvel's first real hit movie. So suddenly, any movie studio that can latch on to a good comic book, a hot comic book, has a chance of getting a great hit and a great franchise. So comics have suddenly become a breeding ground for some of the most expensive movies.
Do you recall which of the Hulk movies made more money?
I thought that the second one was a little bit better than the first one. They were a little bit different. You had a different guy playing the Hulk.
Yeah.
And I don't know, they did pretty well. They weren't as big hits as Iron Man and Spider-Man, but they were successful. And I know they're going to do a sequel. So, you know, what can I say?
Out of all movies that have been done, do you have a favorite?
Well, I think the best ones, to me, were the X-Men, Spider-Man, and Iron Man. Iron Man was a real surprise to everybody, except me, the minute I heard that Robert Downey Jr. was in it. In fact, it was interesting. I got a call from him before the movie started, when he was hired. He wanted to have lunch with me and just talk about the character, see how I felt about it. So there's a restaurant in Beverly Hills, and it's the kind of place where a lot of show business people go. And I've gone there a few times, but I called for reservation and I said, for Stanley and Robert Downey Jr., I want to tell you, I got the best table they have ever had because I mentioned his name. And then the other day I had lunch with Kenneth Branagh, who's directing Thor. Same thing, I called the restaurant lunch for Stanley and Kenneth Branagh. I got the best table again. So you got to try to have lunch with famous directors and actors. That's the only way to go.
I believe your first story you wrote for Timely was a Captain America story?
I think it was a two-page story, two-page prose story. Yeah. In those days, in the early days of comics, it was very funny. In order to pay less postage when you sent the magazines out, they had to be classified as magazines, or else you had to put more postage when the publisher mailed them out. Now, they didn't consider a comic book a magazine, but if there were 2 pages of text in the book, then they would consider it a magazine. So in the early days, every publisher had somebody write a 2-page text piece that was not illustrated, just 2 pages of words. None of the readers read those because they didn't care about them. They wanted the script. So the worst writers in the world were hired to write those things because it didn't matter. So when I first came to work for Timely, that was what I wrote, a 2-page text thing. That's how important I was my first day there.
Do you recall Mickey Spillane writing some of those?
Yep, Mickey Spillane wrote. In fact, he was a great guy. We became somewhat friendly. He's the guy who wrote that book, I and the Jury, if you remember that.
Oh, the Mike Hammer?
Mike Hammer stories, yeah.
What would be the earliest character you could think of, an ongoing character that you created?
I did so many in those early days that They lived a little while and then they fell by the wayside. One was called the Destroyer, one was called Father Time, I think one was called Hurricane. I know anything that was a word became a character. You wrote it and forgot about it.
The Destroyer had a little comeback. Roy Thomas may have had something to do with that. He always liked the Golden Age characters. It seems like Marvel wants to give you full credit for everything. But I've noticed that when you have time in an interview, you frequently will say, and the interviewer would say, you created Spider-Man, you created X-Men, you created the Hulk and all this. But frequently when you have enough time and it's more than a sound bite, you say, I like to say co-creator because I always work with talented artists and they deserve recognition too. And I don't really have a question connected to that, I just want to applaud you for that.
Thank you. I'm a wonderful person.
Is there a super villain or hero that you ever thought of, but you never got the opportunity to do anything with it?
No. You see, I was the editor and the art director. I was the editor-in-chief. So anything I wanted to do, I could do. So I was never frustrated. If I had an idea for somebody, I said, let's do it. And we did it. And I always liked what I did because, well, you can probably tell listening to me, I am my biggest fan. So I loved everything I did. That's the reason I was able to work so fast and turn out so many books. Because since I'm a big fan of everything I write, when I wrote a story, I never had to make any corrections. I'd read it, I'd say, this is great, and I'd say, so we moved very quickly.
Did everybody notice how he hopped up on the stage? I went to dinner with you one time in San Diego. We were at the San Diego convention, and you were doing some work for Byron Price, and he invited me along. And we went to this restaurant, great restaurant, but you couldn't quite tell where the entrance was. And there was a wrought iron fence outside, and Stan just kind of like leapt over it. And so that was the first time I saw him make a superhero movie.
You wanted to know how it'll affect Marvel, having Disney buy them? I gotta put your minds at ease. Marvel is gonna function independently the way they always have. Disney is too smart to interfere with what Marvel does in comics. They're too smart to interfere with Marvel's triumphs in movies. It is going to be such a great deal for Marvel because now they have all of the power of Disney's distribution and advertising and marketing know-how. So it's great for Marvel, and it's not going to change. Disney, they're smart. These are not dumb people. They're the biggest studio in the world. They know what they're doing. They're leaving Marvel alone, but they own them. By the same token, Marvel is, as I say, is profiting by all the things Disney can bring them. I've gotten very friendly with the Disney people. I've always been friendly with the Marvel people. They're very compatible. It's going to be good for Disney. It's going to be good for Marvel. It won't change a thing as far as the characters you know and I hope you love. Yeah, they'll just be better than ever. It was a very smart move, buying Marvel. Those of you who are familiar with the Marvel Superheroes TV animated show, I forget what it's exactly, Superhero City or something. Naturally, a city needs a mayor, and they asked me if I would do the voice of the mayor. Ham that I am, I couldn't say no. So I've been doing the voice for that. And the only thing that bothers me, when The Simpsons gave me a little thing in The Simpsons, they drew it to look like me. When the Japanese manga book used me for cameos, they have them look like me. But in this Marvel Superhero City thing, they just drew a funny-looking mayor who looked nothing like me. I think what happened is they made up the mayor and drew him, and then after he was established, they said, ooh, maybe we'll get Stan to play the voice, and it was too late to change the drawings. I hope in the next series that we can have the mayor bumped off or something, and they need a new mayor, and they'll make them select me. But, oh, if you all write letters.
In your lunch with Robert Downey Jr., what did you tell him about Tony Stark and Iron Man?
Well, I told him that I had always pictured Iron Man, Tony Stark, to be like Howard Hughes. He was wealthy, he was a genius, he was an adventurer, a little bit eccentric. Women loved him, he loved women, but in order for people to care about him, if somebody is too perfect, nobody likes him. He also had a bad heart, which was caused by his origin, you all know that. And he never knew when he would expire. So because of that, he was afraid to have any commitment with any woman. He didn't want to marry a woman he'd love, and a few hours later she might be a widow. So that gave a tragic cast to his life. And the funny thing is, females love that angle. And when we were publishing all our comic books, Iron Man used to get more mail from females than any of our comics. There was something about him being rich, handsome, glamorous, and about to die any minute. Apparently turned women on. I don't know. But, you know, we talked about a lot of things. I told him about how I felt the role should be played a little bit, and I don't even remember all of it, but I'm sure I was brilliant and had to be because the movie was so good.
And what is she? Comics are like modern day mythology. And as with mythology, there are certain values that are communicated. And how do you feel about that, about both comics connecting with mythology and also the idea of communicating values through this type of literature?
Comics are a form of present-day mythology. That's absolutely true. As far as any values or moral judgments or things like that, it goes beyond comics. Anything you write, anything that's printed, anything that's televised, or any movie you see, all forms of entertainment have a way of affecting the public and the people who are being entertained by them. And some people like to put subliminal messages in what they're writing, performing. Some people are just into it for entertainment. Some people feel, I want to proselytize the audience as well as entertainment. It just depends on who's doing the story and how it's being done.
What about you?
What was that?
What about you?
In my case, I must admit, I mainly have been concerned with trying. I know, considering how dull I am up here now, it's tough for you to believe this, but I've always tried to be as entertaining as possible in my stories. The only thing as far as any sort of message coming across, I was always aware young kids read our stories as well as older ones. And I never wanted to put anything in that I thought would be harmful to young people. I didn't try to make them too overtly sexy, or I never tried to make the villain seem more glamorous than the hero. And I tried to give the feeling that, I guess the one thing I tried to really stress was anti-bigotry messages, that people should not be bigoted. It's okay to dislike anybody in the world that you want to dislike, but you shouldn't dislike him or her because of the race, color, religion, creed. Just dislike the person for being a person, or like them for being a person, and that's all. And beyond that, I put no messages in. I tried to. I usually just try to tell an entertaining story. Peter Parker's aunt had wanted him to meet this girl, Mary Jane, for the longest time. She was the daughter of a next-door neighbor or something. And the aunt would always say to Peter, she's such a nice girl, you should meet her. Well, all you got to do is say to a teenage boy, I want you to meet a nice girl, and he'll run for the hills. So Peter tried never to meet her. Finally, at the end of one story, he opens up the door, and there she is standing in the doorway, and she is a knockout. and she has the line, "Face it, Tiger, you hit the jackpot." And I love that line, and I'm so sorry they didn't use it in the first movie.
I've heard you quoted a couple times, including in the Marvel Masterworks Daredevil, the first collection of Daredevil Marvel Masterworks. You cited the battle between Daredevil and the Submariner as one of your all-time favorite stories. Along with the Face It Tiger, you hit the jackpot story. Can you cite any others that you hold dear as some of your favorites?
I love them all. I love the Silver Surfer stories. There was one.
The Silver Surfer was one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah.
And you got the, you could really, it's kind of prophetic or, wax eloquent. You get to be a little more poetic with that strip than you got to with others.
In the Silver Surfer, I used to have him, I tried to make him comment on the human condition from the point of view of an outsider. Like, he'd be cruising around on a surfboard and he'd say, "What's the matter with the human race? They have this beautiful planet, beautiful weather, and all the food they could want growing up. They have oceans and land, and yet they fight, and they have war, and they hate each other, and they have crime. Are they insane? Why don't they appreciate..." All the little philosophical, corny things that I always think of, I was able to bring out of the mouth of the Silver Surfer, so I liked him. And I had him talk in kind of a semi-Shakespearean biblical phraseology kind of way. One story I remember that I liked, it was a Daredevil story, and it's hard for me to remember it. There was a black fellow who had been a cop, and either he got blinded in the line of duty as a cop, as an officer, or he was in the army and he got blinded in the army, I forget. But he comes back and he's unhappy, he's almost suicidal. What'll he do as a blind man? And Daredevil, when somebody wants to kill him, and Daredevil pretends, it was a complicated thing, but the two assassins who want to kill the blind man attack him. They don't know Daredevil is there. Daredevil fights and defeats them in such a way that they think the blind man had done it. And now, by God, nobody's ever going to pick on that blind guy again. And also, he gave the blind man a new reason for wanting to live. And I thought that was one of the most emotional stories I had ever written. I got to find it someday. I just thought of it now.
I think that one of the most interesting things about Captain America and all the many, many decades that he's been around was when you brought him back in the 60s, the idea that he had to deal with being a man that felt like he was out of his time, that he really didn't belong in the 60s. He was a man from the 40s and having to kind of live to adapt, and that was compounded by a new girlfriend that reminded him of his old girlfriend. Do I really love her, or am I just reminiscing of my old girlfriend? So those are things that are a little bit beyond what a lot of people would expect out of the comic. A little more literary, a little more depth.
Well, I tried to make it, he felt he was an anachronism. He was somebody from the past. And yet he had to adjust to living in the modern age when things were a little different. Now there were hippies and there was rock music and stuff like that, which hadn't existed. So what I was trying to do, unfortunately, Captain America had always been a two-dimensional character. He was just a strong, nice guy who fought bad guys, but there was nothing much about him. I just tried to give him a little more depth, that was all. And it was fun writing him.
You accomplished that. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Stan. I want to thank the Rock and Comic Con for giving us this unique, intimate way to visit with Stan.
Excelsior!